In a remote village nestled deep within a forest, there was a legend that had been whispered from generation to generation. They called her the Blind Witch. The village was a small, close-knit community that didn't welcome outsiders easily. Everyone knew each other's business, but there was one house, perched on the far edge of the village, that everyone avoided: the house of the Blind Witch. Her name was Sylvia, and she had been blind since birth. She lived alone, with only the trees and shadows as her company. The villagers told stories of how she could see things that no one else could. She would stare blankly into the air, her milky white eyes wide open, and describe things happening miles away, or events that had yet to occur. It was as if something else guided her senses. Some said she had made a pact with dark forces, but no one dared confront her. One night, a stranger, a young man named Peter, arrived in the village. He was an outsider, unfamiliar with the village's customs or its eerie legends. Desperate for a place to stay, he knocked on every door, only to be met with cold refusals. Finally, one old villager, filled with a mix of pity and fear, whispered to him, "Go to the house at the edge of the woods. She'll take you in, but beware. You might not like what you find." Peter, weary and desperate, made his way through the twisted, leafless trees until he reached the dilapidated house. He hesitated, but then, with a deep breath, knocked on the creaking wooden door. The door swung open on its own. Inside, a small candle flickered, casting long shadows on the walls. Peter stepped in cautiously. There, sitting in a rocking chair by the fire, was Sylvia. Her head turned sharply towards him, even though she couldn't see. A strange smile stretched across her thin lips. "I knew you would come," she whispered softly. Peter froze. How could she know? I just need a place to stay for the night. I'll leave at dawn," he stammered. She tilted her head, as if listening to something far away. "Of course, but remember, every choice has a consequence. Once you enter this house, your path is set." Reluctantly, Peter nodded and sat on a rickety chair near the fire. They talked little that night, but every now and then, Sylvia would speak up, saying things that made Peter's skin crawl. "Your sister misses you," she murmured at one point. Peter's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't mentioned his sister to anyone. "Haha, how do you know about her?" Sylvia just smiled and turned her empty gaze towards him. "I see things others can't. I hear whispers of what's to come." Trying to shake off the unease, Peter lay down on a makeshift bed she provided. Exhaustion quickly took over, and he fell into a restless sleep. But his dreams were not his own. He found himself wandering through the house, each step echoing in the silence. Shadows twisted and writhed on the walls. He felt drawn to a door at the end of a dark hallway. Against his will, he reached out and opened it. Inside, he saw Sylvia, standing in the center of a strange symbol drawn on the floor. Her eyes were no longer clouded. They were black as obsidian, staring right at him. She raised her hand, and the door slammed shut behind him. In his dream, Sylvia's voice was clear, echoing with an otherworldly power. "You came to me seeking shelter, but you brought more than yourself here. You brought it." Peter tried to move, but he couldn't. An invisible force held him in place. "You brought the shadow with you," Sylvia continued, her voice lowering to a hiss. "It's been following you for days. I can see it now, wrapped around your soul." Peter woke with a start, drenched in sweat. It was still night, and the house was silent. Too silent. He got up, determined to leave. But when he opened the door, he was no longer in the house. The landscape outside was twisted, warped. Trees loomed like skeletal hands, and the hung in the sky, cracked and blood red. He turned back, but the house was gone. In its place stood Sylvia, her blind eyes fixed on him. "Welcome to my world," she whispered. "You see, the moment you knocked on my door, you invited it in. The shadow that's been feeding on your fear, whispering doubts in your ear. I tried to warn you." Peter backed away, panic rising. "What do you mean? I just needed a place to stay." Your desperation called to it. Now you're trapped here, in its domain, a prisoner of your own fear. The more you struggle, the tighter it holds. Peter turned and ran, his feet pounding against the earth. But no matter how far he ran, he couldn't escape the twisted landscape. The shadows seemed to stretch and reach for him. Sylvia's voice echoed in his mind. "Your only way out is to face it. But do you have the courage?" Peter stopped, breathing heavily, and turned around. The shadow loomed behind him, a dark, formless entity that seemed to pulse with malevolence. He felt its cold presence seep into his bones, filling him with a despair so deep he could barely breathe. He took a step forward, and the shadow lunged at him. And then, darkness. When the villagers awoke the next morning, they found Peter's body at the edge of the forest. His eyes were wide open, staring blankly at the sky. There were no signs of injury, no marks on his body, just his eyes, as white and empty as Sylvia's. The villagers buried him near the woods, murmuring prayers under their breath. And the house of the blind witch? It stood empty once more, waiting for the next soul to wander in, to knock on the door. But they all knew. Once you entered that house, you never truly left. The shadow would follow, and Sylvia would watch, always watching with her unseeing eyes.